How are borders constructed, legitimized, and maintained? Do they act as barriers that divide and heighten tensions, or do they instead serve as bridges, as points of contact? How and why do people choose to either transgress or uphold boundaries? Are borders determined primarily from the top down or from the bottom up? And what do these complexities reveal about the purpose and meaning of state boundaries and their role in shaping citizenship and national belonging? What exactly happens in these spaces in between? These are some of the many important questions that our panelists have raised and sought to answer in their stimulating papers that focus on the borderlands between France and Germany during 3 periods of post-war reconstruction. What these papers do is reflect on both the construction of borders and boundaries and on what happens in the borderlands themselves. What does it mean to live on the border? As the panelists demonstrate, it all depends on who you are, whether you're the occupier or the occupied. It also is based on your class, your nationality, your race, your gender. Alison CARROL has focused on the rebuilding of the border between France and Germany following the Franco-Prussian War. She addresses not only the symbolism that the French state and elites accorded to the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine and the boundary itself, and these are things that are central to most works on the region, but she also explores how regular people experience living with the border, as well as adapted the symbolism for their purposes. She concludes that people developed a sense of difference at the borders and that new policies and identities are not simply crafted centrally and disseminated outward, but take shape in significant ways along the periphery itself. The border between France and Germany after 1871 was built by high politics and at the grassroots. And the next question she asks is that we should think about this interaction between these 2 imperatives. And I'm wondering if one area that you could maybe look at, and I think that you do this already, is looking at the press, the local press, because it does interact with both the French and the German metropole, as well as clubs, associational life. I think you mentioned the Club Vosgien, so quite important one. I also want to come back to a point that you made about borders being these points of contact, especially the transnational dimension of your research. The belief that Alsace as a border region acted as a bridge, and sometimes the term hyphen is also used to describe this relationship and its relationship to France and Germany, is very interesting, and this is something that Julia addresses as well in her paper. And this imagery is actually still used today, and I think about the Parc du Rhin, which straddles the 2 sides of the Rhine and really is the embodiment of this idea that Strasbourg is the European city par excellence. And so I think that this transnational dimension really is really an important part of your research, and really how you can explore that frontier mentality as it exists in this context. Something too that I wanted to bring up is that you mentioned François Roth in your work, and how he talks about the fact that the French had very little influence on the redrawing of that border. And there's some research that Catherine Dunlop, who's actually presenting on Sunday, and for those of you who are Alsacophiles, that's on the last panel on Sunday. She's been doing research on cartographers and on the actual mapping of the new border, and what she's found is actually there's a lot more collaboration between cartographers, French and German. So both of them coming to the border region to develop these boundaries, and in fact established, used the same instruments, established cartographic standards as well. And so she argues that in fact what they were doing is that they were trying to determine a good border map that would reflect a European consensus. And so it raises the question of, do good borders in fact make good neighbors? Julia WAMBACH opens up a new border, or the development of a new border, the new border separating France and Germany after the First World War, when France regained Alsace-Lorraine. But at this time, France was also an occupying power. And what Julia investigates is how the newly established border between France and Germany after 1918 was also affected by the French occupation in Germany, and then she compares this to what happens after 1945. And so this is a huge field, as Karen indicated, really a massive project, and very interesting as well to bring in that comparative element. So using this approach, she highlights the similarities, but also the very important changes that take place, the differences between the different periods of occupation in the aftermath of these two world wars. And what she really highlights is the fact that these barriers and boundaries were quite precarious. She makes that distinction between the permanent borders and the temporary borders of the occupation zones, and this really does complicate that experience of living along the borders. So it's not just this top-down approach of establishing the presence of the French military and the French state in these areas, but also what happens along these borders as well. And something that really comes across in her work is the fact that France really feels this need to legitimize itself, to legitimize its claims both in 1918 and in 1945, that it deserves to be there, that it should be there. And I think that something that comes across, especially in those images that you use, is the fact that this power is very gendered. And this sort of links into what Karen is doing in her own specific case study. But I'm wondering if maybe that's something that you could reflect on as well in your work, is the fact that this is very much, at least in the occupation part, that this is a very militarized, very gendered notion of power, and using this to legitimize France's claims. Something too that I was thinking about is the fact that France's colonial experience has something to do with the way in which they approach these areas, and something to think about as well. And this also comes back to what the Germans were doing in the area during the Reichslang period. They referred to this as sort of internal colonization, that these liminal regions are seen as these colonies that need to be colonized and brought into the center. So this comparative dimension is really interesting, but I see that it raises all sorts of problems and difficulties, and especially because you're dealing almost with apples and oranges, with post-18 being so different from post-45. And so I think that also is another thing about the post-45 is you're also dealing with the different borders between the different zones. So that might be something I'm very interested to see how people living on those borders of the borders, complicates it even more. And some of these peoples living along the borders between different zones of occupation actually found themselves being juggled between different occupation zones and having very different experiences, whether they were under French occupation or American occupation. Karen Adler complicates the story even further by discussing this relationship between the occupied and occupiers and how they live together, by complicating the politics of occupation, showing the complex power networks of class, race, and gender that were at play in the occupation of Germany by the French troops. And something that she argues in particular is the fact that there is a very racialized narrative here that held Moroccan soldiers responsible for rape, and that this needs really to be unpacked and reassessed. And this term Marokkaner, what does it mean? It needs to be historicized. And I love this line that you use, that nationalist German hatred of conquest after the First World War was metonymized via its race-sex nexus, so that defeat and the shame of it looked like an oversexed black soldier in French uniform. And I think this is a fantastic description of what it meant for these women, or this understanding of the space that they were inhabiting within this occupation zone. Something too, though, that I wanted to bring up with that point, though, and you mentioned the black shame on the Rhine and harking back to what happened after 1918, but I'm thinking too that this notion of race is not strictly German, that you have very similar rhetoric being used by the French during the First World War about the use of French troops and women being terrified about being raped by French troops. So on the one hand, I think that the Nazi rhetoric definitely amplifies that racist component, but it's not a strictly German fear. The other thing too, coming back to the notion of race, I'm wondering, and you talk about the language that's used by the victims, was it similar to the kind of language that they were using when they were describing the rapes by Soviet soldiers? Because I think the racial component also comes across in the way in which Soviet soldiers are described and so I'd like to sort of see how the language compares, and I think that this is a really fascinating part of and very important part of your research, is the language being so gendered in this case, and the importance of reading against the grain, which is something that is still not done frequently enough. It seems to be common sense, but it still isn't done all that much. So thank you for raising that point. So borders may be fluid, the most extreme case being French occupation zone, which was only temporary, but even the more permanent borders established between France and Germany after 1871, 1918, and 1945 could be crossed, either legally or illegally. But borders are nonetheless very real, even if the boundary itself isn't as impregnable as, say, the Berlin Wall. They, of course, delimit the power of sovereign states, but they, more importantly, divide groups of people in very tangible ways by physically separating them from each other and by differentiating them from their neighbors through laws, education systems, language, customs, and even time zones, as Julia pointed out. As the three speakers demonstrate, borders are also imagined, and Karen uses the term a metaphorical space. This does not make them any less real, however, and in fact, as we can see in the three case studies, the meanings accorded to borders were in some ways more powerful and longer lasting than the actual physical barriers erected by either the French or the German state. And in this case, I think that a term that I think was very useful is this notion of a mental map, and Karen talks about mapping, and I think that this idea of the mental map can describe what happens or what takes place in these border regions. And this is where distinguishing or understanding how your nation, your region, your town, your heimat relates to others is a really interesting way of understanding this, and this imagined component of the border. And conceptualizing the physical spaces that people inhabit and how they're limited by specific boundaries, whether real or imagined, shapes people's sense of identity as well as community. And they're constructed by a whole host of elements from the top down and from the bottom up. So currency, flags, curriculum, but also songs, festivals, rituals, cuisine, environment, bodies, notions of race. States establish borders after wars based on economic or geopolitical imperatives. However, as we've seen in the three case studies presented to us today, populations living in these spaces in between created their own mental map that turned borders into these meaningful divisions, ones that either upheld or rejected, as they found themselves or others in their or someone else's land. I'd like to open this up to questions. I don't know if you wanted to respond to my points first, or should we open it to questions first? I don't know if you wanted to get some questions first, or...
If the audience have got any.
Are there any questions? Yes, if you could give your name and your political affiliation, your institutional affiliation, please.
Yes. So, is this, I don't know. So my name is David Hensley, and I am at Pennsylvania State University, and I actually have a comment and then a question for Karen ADLER. Talking about kind of these racialized rapes and abortions, it reminded me of an anecdote that my doctoral advisor, who is Belgian, told me about. You know, you had extensive Belgian missionary work in the Congo, and then when there was violence between the Belgians and the Congolese, you had these sort of very on the one hand, of course, ironic but incredibly tragic tragic episodes of Belgian nuns who had been raped by Congolese men going to get abortions, because that was just considered so transgressive. I wanted to ask, so in the context of so this is in French-occupied Germany after World War II. How did French occupation forces, so French officialdom, sort of react to attempts by German women to obtain abortions? Because this is before the 1970s law, I assume, and so I'm just curious how they if you even came across this and how they reacted to that.
That's a very good question, which I'm not completely in a position to answer, because the materials that I've found so far are too disparate and partial to be able to say that. But there was supposed to be a different kind of hiatus as far as abortion law was concerned for this particular kind of, you know, it's like it's a border period. You know, I think you talk about time. So there's this kind of in-between period as well as in-between space, if you like. And there were special laws. The little bits of evidence that are in my files, sorry, I don't want to go into the kind of details about how annoying Vincennes is, but Vincennes is just unbelievably annoying. And, you know, none of the gendarmerie files have been available for me for 2 years, for example. So that's been kind of irritating. But the little bits of sort of references to attempts by women to go and seek redress from, you know, French regional sort of middle-ranking officers were often very met with great hostility. And, you know, there's one who kind of said, well, you know, the Germans did that a lot in France, and now it's your turn. That is far too anecdotal to be a reply to that question, and I can't actually give you a proper answer, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yes. Oh.
Great. Yeah. Thanks very much. This is on, yeah? Yep. My name is Alex Dowdall, and I'm from Trinity College Dublin, and I've got a question for Alison CARROL, and I just wanted to know what you do you think that, I suppose, the fear prospect and or expectation of war plays a major part in the emergence of the border mentalities and the localized kind of sense of difference that you're describing in your paper? And if so, how much of a part of that how much of that is a part of a specific Franco-German border mentality, and would that in turn be then different from, I suppose, border mentalities that may emerge in different zones around France? So the Franco-Belgian border, or the Franco-Italian border, the Franco-Swiss border, and the Franco-Spanish borders, where the prospect of war isn't as much of a prospect.
Yes, that is a really good point, and that the examples that I found about the rumours, I was trying to root that in something, and that's exactly it. It's the fear of war and the particular shape that this takes on this border because of historical experience, because of what had happened after 1870. And I think that you're right about that. And there's lots of examples from the turn of the 20th century up to the outbreak of war in 1914, where Alsatians kind of adopt the role of spokesman for peace, and especially the socialists will take to the floor in the Reichstag to argue against France going to war with Germany to recover the lost provinces. You know, they'll make statements that they remain attached to France, but that they don't want war to be restored. And I think it does take on a particular local character in Alsace-Lorraine, which then interacts in ways that I'm not completely clear of with kind of broader international concerns and broader international ideas about war. And that, yeah, thank you very much. That's a really good point.
Can I just make a tiny little remark just in response? I'm not sure what the situation is on the German side of the border, but in French Lorraine, there's a very interesting incident which you may want to look at in 1912. And something happens in the prefecture, and an official accidentally sends out the mobilization order to one small little village, and the village mobilizes. And it's kind of turned into a national media event, and like it's kind of like displayed as a kind of an example of this kind of like constant readiness that the border populations have. You know, even one tiny little village is always about ready to go to war against Germany. You know, so it's a kind of a, perhaps it taps into those issues.
Yeah, and I found that like the ideas about horseshoes, they're ordering more horseshoes. We all know what this means. Let's get worried. Let's be concerned about this. And so how different ideas and different things feed in. I'll have to. Can I speak to you afterwards to get the details of that? At the back.
I also have a question for Alison. My name is Tony Steinhoff, and I'm at the University of Quebec at Montreal, donc UQAM. And this question actually could also, in a direction, or in part, go to Julia WAMBACH, but in interest of time, I'll just focus it this way. With respect to Alsace, I mean, I find your comments very, very interesting, very fascinating on a number of levels. But obviously, one of the questions about the border that's very different here is that we're creating a border between two parts, or what used to be two parts of the same country. So the question of border in part is a political territorial one. Mental maps might be one way of thinking about it, but also just a very fact of interiorizing, recognizing this border has been imposed. But the other aspect, and this struck me with one of the slides you used, is that there's a temporal component that's very important here that I felt was kind of missing from your presentation, because the attitudes about the border, the ways of thinking about it, are very different in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War as compared to, say, the eve of World War I. And that raises the question of temporality of border recognition, because obviously the political border has been constructed and demarcated fairly quickly. And finally, so bringing the question of time into the recognition and the reality, so to speak, of the border is something I would encourage you to think about. But also with this matter of transgression, that raises the question, well, what are the rules that are in play? The formal ones, the informal ones, and where do the Germans fit in all of this? You talked about how authorities in Paris, you've talked about how Alsatians think about it, but obviously the Germans, above and beyond the military dimensions, are also a major player in this game about constructing what this new border means. And I was wondering, we don't have to go in at length right now, but that's also something that perhaps needs to be introduced into this interrogation.
Yes, thank you. I can't say very much about in answer to a lot of your questions because I haven't done the research yet. The examples that I had of the hunting, the mushroom foraging, all of them were from the period after 1900. Because I started this as context, I thought that I'd begin by looking at the immediate period, and as always happens, didn't get enough time to go through the earlier documents while I was getting the paper together. But I think that that's the temporal dimension is something that I need to look at and draw out more clearly. The cult of Alsace-Lorraine that I talked about and that Liz mentioned is something that's much livelier in the early years of annexation, and whereas at the beginning of the 20th century it's just not as present as it was, and so there's other changes that are going on here, and I need to tie what's happening to the border to that. Equally with the Germans and how they fit in, I haven't done that either. So this was very much focused on the two sides of the border, so the population of the Vosges and the population of Alsace. And this is something, the fact that it's two populations who had been members of the same nation state is also something that I need to go further, and I need to think a lot more closely about the difference between Alsace and Lorraine, because the border that goes through the Vosges is separating the Alsatian departments from the Vosges, and there's linguistic differences, there's cultural differences, but what happens in Lorraine, where the border just cuts through a province and you lose the section that's now the Moselle. So I think the connections between these two populations who were members of the same state were much closer than those between the Alsatians and the departments of the Vosges, but this is also something that hopefully the next paper will be able to answer a lot more of these questions. But thank you for your points.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
Hi, Drew Flanagan from Brandeis University. Just wondering, it's sort of specifically, I think for Karen, but also for all of you in a way. I was wondering about this question of the gendered nature of occupation and of penetration of territory, and this sort of, you can talk about it in sort of literary terms that way, but and how the sort of larger questions of gender relations and then on a broader level of relations between occupier and occupied on the ground level that are raised here, because I wonder if it's possible to draw too clear of a line between sexual violence and sexual relations between them, not from the standpoint of that they're not different things, but because there's a sort of spectrum, I think sometimes in the minds of the actors, where they think of sex as being part of the what they're owed as conquerors or something like that. You know, there are various sorts of ways of thinking about how these different things relate to each other. And so I was thinking of something I was reading, because I'm working in this area, and I've actually been in contact with you before, so it's kind of funny. I was thinking of something I was reading from General Delattre de Tassigny during the invasion. At the very beginning in 1945, he writes a directive for the troops, and he talks about how, well, we all know, you know, the effect of the eternal feminine on soldiers, right? And he has this sort of like very, you know, short thing in a 30-page document that's handed out to all the officers. And is basically, he seems to be talking about consensual relationships in this case, that they're going to happen and it's expected, but it's left ambiguous, right? I mean, it's not, there doesn't seem to be any distinction made there, and it might tell us something about the culture of armies around these questions, that maybe the distinction's less important to them. So I wonder if there's a way we could sort of consider it as a sort of spectrum, at least from their standpoint. That's all. That's good.
Okay. I rather deliberately did not go into the question of whether these rapes really took place or whether they didn't. Okay, that was the work that this kind of civil court, if you like, wasn't really a court, but they had witnesses and people were judging at different sorts of levels, and you know, when the paper trail got to the finance department, that's where they became the most the kind of harshest, if you like, for obvious reasons, because they didn't want to pay out any more money. So I don't particularly want to, I really don't think as a historian I can yet go into that, those sorts of judgments, because they are already so judged on terms that are different from mine. And I also don't want to try and get inside soldiers' heads. I don't think that's what I can do, and I very much do not talk about the penetration by armies of lands as a gendered thing. That's actually not something that I do. Having said that, clearly there were relationships that were happening willingly between the people involved, you know, not just the men, the French soldiers and German women, but presumably between French soldiers themselves, between men and men, between women and women, clearly that that is going on. Sorry, my mind has just lost its train of thought that it was about to. I was about to argue something. Sorry, I'm really sorry. I'm terribly jet lagged. I think my job is to try and establish what sort of meanings these things had, not to kind of rejudge people who have already been judged. But I mean, clearly those sorts of relationships went on. And for example, the people that I've interviewed, because I've interviewed a number of kind of anciens combattants, which I didn't have time to go into here, and they're all very effusive about the lovely relations they had with the German women. You know, one man got very misty-eyed when he was kind of saying about how he had to leave Stuttgart and had to leave his billet, and he wished he could have stayed there. His wife was sitting in the next room, and he kind of, you know, there was obviously this kind of great heartfelt thing. That's where his life should have been, and he's ended up, you know, in the Lorraine. I mean, he was a Lorrain. And several others, you know, the others who were stationed in Berlin, you know, one, according to his own account, he seemed to spend all his time in the dance cafes around Lake Tegel and the various lakes that there are in Western Berlin, and there was apparently, seems to have been an awful lot of places that one could go and dance and, you know, do the things consequent on dancing. So there is a very, you know, there are very, very different sets of narratives going on. That's all I can kind of say at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our panelists for excellent papers.